Hello, and thank you for joining us today for this webinar series, Perspectives on Urban Flood Resilience, How Different Fields Tackle One of the World's Most Prevalent Disasters. This webinar series has been convened by Dr. Kristin Raub, who is a postdoc here at CUAHSI. This is a 6-part series, which will continue each week at this time until October 13th. Next week. And so this is the 5th talk in the series. And if you're interested in viewing the previous webinars, they can be found on the CUAHSI YouTube channel. And before we get started with today's speaker, I wanted to give you a little bit of information about CUAHSI. My name is Lisa Muchachito, and I'm the Community Outreach Specialist for CUAHSI. And CUAHSI is a consortium of universities for the advancement of hydrologic science, Inc. And our mission is to advance water science by strengthening interdisciplinary collaboration, providing critical infrastructure through our data services, and promoting education in water science at all levels through programs like this Cyberseminar Series. Sorry, I went the wrong way. We seek to fulfill our mission in 2 ways: by providing community and educational services, as well as our data services. And our community and educational services include things like providing funding through our grants and fellowships. We have workshops and trainings, the National Water Center Summer Institute program, our Cyberseminar Series, CUAHSI Virtual University, and we have a hydrology guest lecture database. Currently, we are accepting proposals for new training workshops. So if you have a specialized topic you're interested in teaching, CUAHSI can help with that. So just visit our website for more information. And the deadline to apply for that is November 15th. We also have some funding opportunities, 2 of which have upcoming deadlines. The Hydroinformatics Innovation Fellowship, which provides funding for scientists to create a hydroinformatics product to disseminate to the CUAHSI community, and the Pathfinder Graduate Student Fellowship that provides funding for graduate students to travel and add a new site visit to their research. And our data services provide tools such as our 2 data repositories, HydroShare and HIS, or data.cuahsi.org. And we support, or that supports to enable data discovery and archival, data sharing, management, publication, and visualization and analysis. So I would encourage you to reach out to me, to visit our website. You can sign up for our newsletter and or join our community Slack channel to learn more about CUAHSI and different ways that you can get involved. And I'm going to add information for all these things into the chat once we get started. But one more thing, this webinar is being recorded and will be posted on the CUAHSI YouTube channel later. Secondly, we ask that you use the Q&A functionality to submit questions to our panelists. And finally, we expect that all involved in CUAHSI cyber seminars promote and maintain a professional, considerate, respectful, and collaborative virtual environment. And so thank you again for joining. And I'm going to turn it over to Kristin Raub to introduce our speaker.
Thank you for that introduction. Our speaker today is Dr. Siders from the University of Delaware. I am going to allow you to introduce yourself further, but just to reiterate, if you could please post questions using the Q&A function of our chat. I'll be moderating them during, but we will make sure to get to those following her presentation. So without further ado, over to you.
Thanks. And thanks everyone for attending today. I'm really interested to see where the discussion will take us. There's always so many directions we can head. As Kristin Raub said, I'm A.R. Siders. I'm a professor at the University of Delaware. I consider myself an interdisciplinary scholar. I have a law degree and a PhD from an interdisciplinary program. I'm in the Disaster Research Center, the School of Public Policy, and the Geography, and affiliated with Marine Studies because my work focuses primarily on climate change adaptation, particularly policy, how communities are making decisions about how to adapt to hazards like floods, sea level rise, coastal storms, et cetera. and thinking through how they make those decisions, how they evaluate them, how they think about the equity implications. And these are the key takeaways from my talk today. So I'm going to talk primarily about managed retreat as an adaptation strategy. It's highly controversial. It's even more controversial to think about how retreat should happen. So the normative space of how do we do this in the best way possible. Lots of discussion over what the best way possible means, what success looks like in this space. Answering these questions is going to require an interdisciplinary effort on the research front and intergovernmental cooperation on the practice front. But I think there's some room for optimism in that I think even engaging with the really difficult questions that managed retreat raises actually creates a space for us to think creatively and optimistically about how we adapt to the effects of climate change and to hazards like flooding, et cetera. So that's where we're heading. And just as a quick reminder, when we think about categories of adaptation responses to flood issues, we tend to think about the categories of resistance, so putting a barrier between a home and the water, accommodation, such as elevations, the poster child of this one, you let the water come and go, but try to reduce the damage. Retreat, moving homes or other assets, infrastructure away from the hazard in order to reduce exposure, and then avoidance, which is maybe don't build there in the first place. Yeah, and one of the reasons I like to think about these categories and start here is a reminder that retreat is not just one strategy. Like these other categories, it's a category, a suite of adaptation options. So when we talk about retreat, there's actually a multitude of ways we can think about different tools and different approaches to retreat. And I particularly differentiate between unmanaged retreat and managed retreat. So unmanaged retreat is what we see when we see homeowners who just abandon their properties and leave. They're fed up with being flooded, they're fed up with dealing with storms, and they just walk away. And we are already seeing this in the United States. We've seen this after disasters in the past. And this creates problems for the homeowner who's walking away from probably the biggest financial asset in their life, for the neighbors who have to live next to a potentially blighted home now, for the town who has to try to figure out how to take ownership of that land and then do something with it, demolish it, remodel it, resell it, etc. So it's sort of a major problem for everyone. And a better solution is to think about managed retreat. So there are a number of different euphemisms that are used for managed retreat. We can talk about planned retreat, strategic retreats, relocation, resettlement. If anyone is interested in the semantics of managed retreat, I'm happy to have that conversation. I'm a lawyer. I think a lot about terminology, but I'm going to use managed retreat because it's the most technical term. And defining it here as purposeful, planned, usually government-supported movement of people or assets away from hazardous areas. In the United States, this has taken a variety of forms over the years. So we have a lot of historic examples of whole towns that are relocating or of major buildings that are relocating. And these are usually done at the instigation of the towns themselves or the building owners themselves. So this is an example from New York, Coney Island, the Brighton Beach Hotel, where the owners actually picked it up and moved it on platforms using trains. We have examples of Cape Cod, Massachusetts, where homeowners actually floated their homes across the island or across the water to put their homes on the mainland. They're still there with plaques on them showing these homes were relocated due to flooding. We have towns like Niobrara, Nebraska, that relocated more than once due to flooding to get away from them. I love that the Nebraska Historical Society tries to change the narrative around retreat. So instead of this being a defeatist attitude, this is the town that was too tough to stay put. So they relocated many times. We have more modern examples as well, of course. We have Pattonsburg, Soldiers Grove, Valmeyer, Illinois are some of the most famous examples of this. Valmeyer, Illinois, anyone who's interested, there's a great documentary on YouTube about how that relocation took place back in the 90s. And we also have major buyouts, so property acquisitions, and that's where I'll spend most of the time talking. So the top left here is Grand Forks, North Dakota. And the big green space you see along the river was created by purchasing homes that were located along the river, demolishing them, and then creating this park with the open space that we see there. So just a quick overview of the fact that relocation occurs, managed retreat occurs, it occurs in a variety of different ways and has for throughout the entire history of the United States. This isn't a new thing and it's not a future thing, it's a thing that's happening right now and has happened throughout history. We also, of course, have a variety of other types of relocation that aren't climate change instigated. So for example, the Rust Belt and a number of towns, or I grew up on the iron ore range in Minnesota, thinking about towns that have been shrinking and losing population, or some towns that have ceased to exist altogether because of economic changes. And so thinking about what we can learn from those historic examples of other types of towns that are moving their populations and losing them, what lessons can we learn from that for people who are moving because of flooding and hazards? And then one of the other issues I think about a lot is people who want to relocate but aren't able to. So this could include homeowners who want to leave because they're sick of being flooded, but they can't afford to. Maybe they can't afford to sell their home at a loss because the home has lost value because of its history of damage now. Or maybe they're unwilling to sell their home to another family and put another family at the same risk that they've been facing. They're unwilling to sort of pass that buck to someone else. Or we might see situations like Winslow, Nebraska. This was a town that wanted to relocate because of its flooding history, and the state actually told them that they didn't have the legal authority to do so. And so the town is not being allowed to relocate, but instead probably will end up dissipating and becoming parts of other towns rather than maintaining its identity. So there's a lot of people in the United States. We tend to hear the narrative that no one wants to relocate. And that people, because we hear the news stories about people who say, I will relocate over my dead body, I will never relocate, we will never abandon the waterfront, we will rebuild stronger, build back better, etc. We have this narrative that we're not going to relocate. But the reality appears to be that there is an appetite for relocation, and specifically that the appetite for relocation is larger than the current resources available. This is not to say that everyone wants to relocate or that relocate is the best option in every place, but just that there is an appetite and it is larger than the resources available. So retreat is extremely challenging, and it's challenging for a variety of different reasons, ranging from the psychological, that people think about retreat as meaning defeat, or they're very attached to their places. Humans, we develop very emotional attachments to the places that we live. It can actually form part of our identity, as well as to our communities. Maybe we have an optimism bias. We tend to underestimate risk, and so our understanding of risk may drive how much we want to adapt and the ways we think about adaptation. There can also be institutional issues. I'm going to talk primarily about the authority mismatch and the lack of fit in governance here, but there's a lot of financial disincentives for relocation. There's a lot of financial incentives that subsidize risk right now, and so they sort of mask that cost of living in flood-prone areas that we can talk about in the discussion if we want to. And then there's a lot of practical concerns, and I'll talk mostly about the equity issues that are involved in relocation. But there are also practical concerns simply about how do you find funding for this, and what happens to the people after they're bought out? Where do they go? How do we think about tax revenues? Things like that. So there's a whole host of challenges there that also make relocation difficult. And so to start with, I'll think about authority mismatch. And so in thinking about authority mismatch, you think about buyouts. So buyouts are voluntary property acquisitions, and it's a particular type of a property acquisition. So sometimes you'll hear acquisitions and people will redevelop, but a buyout is one where you don't redevelop. So this is the normal pattern. As much as I can say there is a normal pattern for buyouts, they vary quite a bit. But there's a disaster, there's a flood, there's a hurricane, there's some sort of disaster that causes damage. The local government will apply for funding from the federal or state governments. Most of the ones I look at involve federal funding of some level. So they apply for that funding. If they receive funding, if they're successful, the local government then decides where to offer buyouts. So which homes are they going to even offer to acquire? The homeowner decides, because the federally funded programs are voluntary, at least through FEMA and HUD, which are the ones I primarily focus on. So they decide whether they want to accept that buyout or not. If they do, they move out. The home is then demolished. Occasionally it's relocated, but usually the home is demolished. And then the land is maintained as public space, as an open space. So this is sort of the overarching strategy for a buyout. And buyouts are very common. In fact, they are the most common way of addressing repetitive flood loss in the United States. So this is a pie chart by the Government Accountability Office, came out last year, looking at how repetitive flood loss properties have their risk reduced. And you can see that 81% of the repetitive flood loss properties that have had their risk mitigated have had it mitigated through a buyout program. Excuse me. Despite the prevalence of buyouts, one of the things we see is that the number of repetitive flood loss properties is growing. So we are actually helping fewer repetitive flood loss properties than we are creating new repetitive flood loss properties. So in a way, the problem is getting worse rather than getting better. And one of the real reasons that this problem is getting worse instead of better is that we are building actively in the flood zones. And the reason I think about this as an authoritative mismatch is that the federal government does not have authority over where development happens. It does not have the legal authority to tell places that they cannot build in the floodplain. So this is a local and a state issue. But the local and state governments are not the ones who are footing the majority of the bill for the disaster recovery or for the buyout cost. And so there's this mismatch between the authority who is paying the bills and the authority who has and the government that has the authority to reduce those bills on the front end. And so what we see new homes building in floodplains and in flood-prone areas faster than outside of them. One particularly egregious example I point to is in Texas. This is Houston. It's the Canyon Creek development. So the yellow outlines are federally designated flood reservoirs. So they are areas where the federal government was planning to release floodwaters in order to avoid flooding downtown Houston. And then in part because Texas doesn't support zoning, they very much want people to be able to build where they want, and they don't want to have government control over this. So a number of new developments were built inside the flood reservoir. As a result, when Hurricane Harvey hit, the federal government released the floodwaters into that reservoir, and not surprisingly, they flooded the reservoir. And so these homes that were built in this development area were flooded. This has caused a number of lawsuits and other concerns as we see these homeowners who are very angry about this, right? But who's to blame? And it's a very legal question, right? Who do you point your finger at? But it also raises questions about how do you prevent this happening in the future, right? Who has the authority and who has the responsibility to prevent this happening in the future? And so this mismatch between who has different levels of authority and how they're coordinating together is one of the main challenges we see in trying to reduce flood risk and actually stop repetitive flood loss properties from increasing in number. All right, so it's a really quick overview. We could talk a lot more about that if that's where people are interested in, of one of the challenges that are facing managed retreat and floodplain management in general. The next one I'm going to talk about is equity. And this is the one where I'm spending a lot of my research interest these days. So when you think about a buyout program, all of these different steps, every single step has an equity implication. So for example, the disaster step. In the United States, one of the main predictors of who is most affected by floods and other hazards is race and income. So we know that this has a disparate effect on different populations, and that effect is often due to historically racist policies such as redlining or building affordable housing in the floodplains. About 10% of US government subsidized affordable housing is located inside the floodplain. So there's inequity in terms of who is exposed to these disasters and how much damage they experience. Then there's inequity in terms of which local governments are able to get federal funding. When we look at federal funding distribution, as I'll show in a second, we find that it tends to go to larger and denser communities, and under some analyses tends to go to whiter communities at the county level. And so there's an inequity here in terms of who is able to access that, and a major question of, are the communities who most need support able to get that support from the federal government? Once a local government gets funding, it then has to make a decision about who to offer the buyouts to. And there are real equity implications here. Which homeowners you offer to purchase from can make a huge difference in terms of that homeowner's finances, the neighborhood characteristics, the long-term flood risk of the community, and the long-term economic viability of the community. So we'll dig into that one a bit more. There are equity implications as well over what influences homeowner decision to accept or reject buyouts. I mentioned that these are all voluntary. They are all technically voluntary, but there's a lot of research that raises concerns about how voluntary are they really. For example, a homeowner who is facing a $100,000 fee to have to elevate their home, or they can take this buyout. Do they really have a choice? How much choice is that, or how much is that choice being driven by these economic necessities that they're facing? Or how much is it being driven by disinvestment and decisions by the local government to not offer other types of adaptation solutions in that same neighborhood? And then even with the land use, there are equity implications over how the land is being used and who benefits from this. We know green spaces can contribute to gentrification, that green spaces tend to arise more in neighborhoods that are white and wealthier. So how does the open space also contribute to equity concerns? And most of my research focuses in this middle area on local governments applying for funding and then making the decision over who to try to acquire these homes from. Buyouts are really common. As I mentioned, they occur all over the United States. So FEMA, for example, has had a major program in place since 1989. They funded the acquisition of about 45,000 homes in every single state except Hawaii. And that's in about 1,200 counties, which is about 1 in 3 counties in the United States. So many counties across the United States have experience with buyouts, but they have experience at a very small scale, buying up just a few homes at a time. As I mentioned, there are some equity implications. So when we did a statistical analysis of all those buyouts and their location, looking at what's predicting where buyouts are occurring, we find that counties that use buyouts tend to be wealthier and denser. And one of the reasons we hypothesize for this is that these counties have more staff, they have more resources, they have more funding, so they're available to do things like meet the FEMA cost match requirements, or they're able to put together, as one administrator described it, as a 4-inch thick application. Right? These applications can take years. These applications can take thousands of pages of documentation or hundreds of pages of documentation. And so putting them together is no mean feat. They require a lot of technical expertise. So places that can dig into that and have the capacity to engage with those are more likely to get funding for buyouts than counties that do not have those resources. Within those counties, however, a county gets the funding, then what neighborhoods do they offer those buyouts in? And our study found that those buyouts are then offered in neighborhoods that are lower income and have lower population density. The research is actually divided. So there's our study and 2 others that tried to look at racial composition and how race affects these decisions, and came to different conclusions depending on how you define the neighborhood or the county. But people agree that they are offered in lower income areas. And so there's an equity concern there about, are we displacing lower income communities by offering buyouts more often in lower income areas? There's a lot of reasons why buyouts would be offered more and accepted more in lower income areas. So one is the substantial damage finding. After a major disaster, engineers go in and they assess how damaged each household is. If a house is found to be 51% damaged, or more, it is considered substantially damaged. And substantially damaged triggers a number of legal repercussions. For example, it means that you are automatically cost effective to purchase according to FEMA policy if it's under a certain price threshold. And it means that you have you have a retrofit requirement. So if your house is 51% damaged and you want to rebuild, you have to rebuild to elevation standards, you have to rebuild according to new codes. Whereas if it's 49% damaged, you do not. So that 2% change can make a big difference. And we find that more lower value homes get substantial damage findings for a variety of reasons. One is that the engineers who go in and make those assessments are just subjectively more likely to make these determinations. This was found by DeVries and Fraser, who did a series of interviews with these assessors and found that they just have a subjective desire. They think they're helping the homeowners by giving them the substantial damage findings so that they will get more aid. However, they also are requiring those homeowners to potentially do things that are more expensive. And then finally, one reason that these occur more often in lower income areas or lower value household neighborhoods is that wealthy owners are more likely to appeal. So if their home is designated as substantially damaged, they are more likely to go in and appeal that process. According to anecdotes out of New Orleans, one official described it as a fly-by-night, chaotic, Wild West, get what you want process of requesting an appeal to your substantial damaging. And they approved 95% of their appeals without any evidence that the substantial damage finding was inaccurate. So simply walking in, having the boldness to walk in and say, hey, my home isn't substantially damaged, may take away that substantial damage finding. But there are real equity implications in terms of who is willing to engage in that process and who has more of a political voice. So we find this disparate effect of where buyouts are being offered. But the big question, the normative question is that a problem, right? Is that bad? And if it is, where should we be offering buyouts? So recently I've been interviewing buyout administrators, so government officials who are actually implementing these buyout programs. And one thing that I find very interesting is that they're divided. So some of them think that you should absolutely be prioritizing buyouts in low-income areas and in communities of color. So they think the fact that most buyouts are occurring in neighborhoods that are lower income is actually a sign that the program is working. This is a good thing. These homes are more likely to be exposed to hazards. They're more likely to be significantly damaged. Potentially they're older or built to older building codes. The homeowners may be less able to afford insurance or be able to afford things like elevating their own homes. And historically, they have less access to federal funds, to flood management, other drainage, any kind of other investments. So their reasoning is, so of course we should be prioritizing offers in this area. And we actually see critiques that say, hey, in fact, we want more buyouts to go to lower income neighborhoods and to communities of color because we think it's unfair if that funding goes to white neighborhoods. This was a story by NPR who comes to the conclusion that white communities get proportionally more federal buyouts. The money is not doled out to those who need it most, but those whose property is worth more and those who own property in the first place. So they were looking at the county level and very concerned because the normative supposition there is that the buyouts should be going to lower income areas and not to these wealthier, whiter neighborhoods. Similarly, critiques about the program and its reliance on Western European concepts of property ownership and individual property rights rather than community-based decisions about relocation. So there is, on the one hand, a real feeling that we should be prioritizing buyouts in these low-income areas. There are other practitioners who say we should absolutely not be offering buyouts in low-income areas. These homeowners may feel economically coerced to accept the buyout. They may be not able to find affordable housing once they sell their home to you. Maybe they can't find other housing, and then they might become housing insecure, or they might have to leave the neighborhood. They might rely more on their social networks and that community to provide services that they require. And maybe offering buyouts there, because we haven't offered other types of flood mitigation in that same neighborhood, is actually just perpetuating historic disinvestments and historic displacements. So there's a real concern about offering buyouts in low-income neighborhoods and in communities of color. And we see this, for example, after Katrina in New Orleans, there was a proposal to relocate some of the areas that had been most exposed to storm damage. And one of these proposals, one calculation said that if you did that, if you relocated neighborhoods that were most exposed to flood damage, you would relocate 60% of the African-American population of New Orleans. So that's a major concern, right? That's a real racial concern and a real equity concern for New Orleans. And so that program was scrapped. They went with different types of programs. But there are also real concerns about even offering buyouts, not requiring anyone to take them, but even offering them may in some ways be coercive, especially depending on how they're offered and how much money is offered. Offering fair market value, which is the normal price that's offered, may be devalued because homes in lower income and communities of color may have been historically devalued because of racism and other disinvestment. And so you're providing these people with not enough money. So there's this huge divide in terms of how should buyouts be offered. And in some ways, it boils down to this idea of, do you see buyouts as a resource that you should be offering people, right, as giving people priority access to this resource? Or do you see buyouts as potentially as a harm that you should avoid inflicting on people? And we don't have enough evidence about how buyouts actually affect the people who participate in order to determine which one of these it is. We just don't have enough evidence about the long-term consequences of buyouts in order to rectify this challenge. And so practitioners implement their programs in vastly different ways based on their perception of the program and their perception of the equity issues, which of these they prioritize most highly. Now, a deceptively simple answer is to say that the community should decide. And this is deceptive because having the community decide raises all kinds of questions about who is the community and how should that decision be made? And is the decision-making process itself a harmful one? Sorry. So one example I think about is Louisiana and Ile-de-Jean-Charles. Ile-de-Jean-Charles is a tribe in southern Louisiana who needs to relocate in part because of climate change, in part because oil and gas destruction of the wetlands and loss of land in southern Louisiana, and in part because the state put in a levee system, but they put the levee system inland of Ile-de-Jean-Charles. And so the island is not protected by that levee system. And so that makes relocation more necessary in this community. One of the major challenges, though, of having a community decision is understanding, well, who is the community? Is it all the members of the tribe, including people who don't live on the island? Is it all the members on the island, including the one person who's not a part of the tribe? Is it who speaks for the tribe? Is it the leader of the tribe? The tribe is not federally recognized, and so it doesn't have the legal protections. It just has the sort of moral or ethical protections, which unfortunately are a lot less powerful. So thinking about who the community is and who speaks for them is really challenging. And if it's challenging in the context of an island and a tribal nation who have relatively well-defined boundaries, it's even far more difficult when you start thinking about an urban neighborhood or an urban community. And these discussions are not always happy ones. So this example from NPR, where they talked about Ellicott City, Maryland, I just really enjoyed. So one person is absolutely opposed to buyouts. She really enjoys the history of Ellicott City. She says, when you walk through the city, you discover what's in these buildings, you see where slaves were hidden on their path to freedom. This place is worth sticking around for. But one of her neighbors, who used to be a great friend, says, if you pretend that human lives are worth less than historic buildings, you're a despicable person. And I don't have any bones about saying that. You're absolutely despicable. And so these are two neighbors who used to be really good friends, and according to the story, are no longer friends because they have this acrimony over whether or not buyouts should be offered, who should be allowed to move, how much of the town should be preserved. And what's more important? Is it letting people leave so they can be in a safer position, or is it maintaining the historic integrity of the buildings and the neighborhood? And even the process of saying, hey, let's let the community decide, can itself become a really contentious one. It can also be one that's fraught with political voice. So I think about Staten Island after Hurricane Sandy. There were a number of communities, maybe roughly 7 communities, that petitioned for buyouts. They wanted to be relocated. They wanted buyouts to be offered in their community. So here are 2 on Staten Island, and you can see that one, Oakwood Beach, was approved and it was offered buyouts, and the other one was not. Why? And what seems to be, from the case studies that have been done on this, not by me, I'll note, but the answer seems to be that Oakwood Beach had political voice. They petitioned the city for buyouts, and the city said no, because the city wanted to maintain its housing stock. And so then, according to at least one, the residents of Oakwood Beach called up friends in the state Senate and put pressure on the state Senate and on the state level government to offer buyouts. And so the state did. And part of this speaks to who has the voice to make that desire heard, right? Who has the ability to call up a friend in the state Senate and say, hey, we need a buyout, make it happen. And so anytime we start thinking about grassroots organizations, we want that grassroots and we want that community approval and that community engagement. At the same time, we don't want to put the burden on communities that they have to make their voice heard, because then we will only give resources to those who have the political voice to make their desires heard. And so this becomes another tangle. There's a lot more issues we can think about that make this even more complicated. How do we make decisions between historically marginalized communities? How do we think about what elements of historic injustice inform this? There's a timing issue. How do we think differently about homes that are built today than homes that were built 50 years ago? Probably most people do, but right now we treat all of those the same in the law. Right now we treat historic communities and new communities, we treat communities of color and white communities exactly the same under these legal concepts. On the one hand, that's a great approach because we're trying to be fair. On the other hand, applying a fair process to an unfair starting position can't result in a fair outcome. And so how do we modify the process in order to address those historic inequalities that are leading to some of these challenges? We also have lots of questions over what happens to people if they choose to stay. What are the equity implications of people choosing to stay? I like this example, Dauphin Island, Alabama. These homes have been rebuilt roughly 16 times over the last 30 years. They've received $72 million in flood insurance premiums, and they've paid in $9 million. So they're getting a good return on investment for their insurance payments, right? And the question is, how many times should we pay to rebuild a home on a barrier island like this? Should we rebuild it 16 times? There are some repetitive loss properties that have been rebuilt 34 times. Is there an upper limit? And if so, what is that upper limit? And how do we think about what that is and the fairness of it? And then just quickly, one of the areas where I am most optimistic about thinking about managed retreat is actually in shifting our mindset. So right now I work at sort of the intersection of disaster risk reduction and climate change adaptation. And in both fields, we're seeing this shift. Sort of, we want to have more transformation. We want to have more change. We don't want resilience to be just bouncing back, right? We now want it to be bouncing forward. We want it to be building back better. We want it to be doing things differently in the future than we did in the past. Unfortunately, what we get is we're still sort of trapped in this mindset that what we are fundamentally doing with climate change adaptation is protecting what is there right now, rather than seeing it as a process by which we choose what changes will occur. And this is a nuanced but a very difficult conversation to have. And I think about this by looking at history, right? This is my hometown. This is Duluth, Minnesota. This is where I grew up. And you think about some of these images to think about myself that this community has changed significantly over the last 100 years. It does not look today the way it did in 1900. And frankly, in 2100, it won't look the way it does today, even if climate change is not an issue, right? Even if climate change were not an issue, even if we solved it at the COP coming up the end of the month, right? Which we'll cross our fingers. But even if that happened, we would continue to see change because we'll have economic influences, we'll have new technology, we'll have generational changes who will want different things, we'll have social norms that will change. So change is going to happen. And the purpose of climate change adaptation should not be to prevent that change. We have been focusing on the question of what do we preserve. But I love this framework by Sherman et al., who are thinking about this in the ecology perception, but they're thinking about what do we preserve, but then also what do we purposefully change, and what things do we just allow to change on their own. And for every community that we can think about, there are probably things that we would like to purposefully change, whether it's that terrible stop sign on 31st and Main, whether it's that lack of parking, whether it's we want more walkable cities, we need more employment, we want a more diverse community, whatever it is, there are things that we purposefully want to change to achieve a better future. And when we start integrating those choices about purposeful change in the future, as well as what things should we maintain, we open up space for more creative solutions. If we just say, hey, we're going to take status quo and hold on to it, well, A, we are maintaining all of the inequities that are baked into the status quo, and B, we are closing our eyes to all the opportunities that we could be leveraging by having a more embracing change. So Catherine Mock and I have been thinking through how we can engage with the idea of relocation. And one of the things we keep coming back to is this idea of retreat is actually a suite of tools. And we tend to talk about these adaptation options as though they all are alternatives, as though you would elevate or put a seawall in or retreat. But the reality is, of course, that they are going to be much more mixed, right? That we're going to do some of each. And these are the ingredients, but the recipe of how you combine those ingredients and the relative weights of each is going to be based on your goals for the community. And those goals for the community are not a scientific answer. So I love this quote by Ben Zeitchik. He's a hydrologist at Johns Hopkins University. He says, the question of what you do about our coasts is not a rational engineering conversation. It's a conversation about what we want to be as a society, what place means to us as a community, locally, and as a country. And I love this quote because it fundamentally points out this idea that what we are doing with climate change adaptation, the tools to get there, evaluation, those are scientific answers. But at its core, what do we want to be as a society is a value-laden decision. It's a political decision. It's an ethical decision. It is not a scientific answer that has a clear response with error bars. And so we need to keep treating it as a conversation that needs to happen. And one of the main arguments that Catherine and I make with Managed Retreat is that having the conversation about relocation, even if a community decides not to relocate, just having the conversation can help them understand why they are rejecting relocation. To reject it out of hand doesn't help, but to sit down and think about why it is important to stay exactly here, exactly in this house, not just in this area or in this community or on a riverfront in particular, but exactly here. Why is that important? And when you think about what the answer to that question is, maybe other options open up. So maybe it's that I need to stay in this house because this is the house my grandfather built. Great, let's talk about how we might be able to relocate the entire structure to a different parcel in order to protect the house that your grandfather built that you care about. Maybe it's I need to stay here because I need this commute to be close to my job or to my children's school or to family members. Great, let's think about how we could develop new housing and new communities that would enable you to maintain those types of communal ties without needing to be in this risk-prone area. So by even addressing, even if you reject the idea of relocation, just using it as a way to help define the problem space can help us then come up with more creative solutions. So a lot of that was very normative. I'm a lawyer. I'm very comfortable in the normative space. I understand that's not where everyone is going to be comfortable with. So I'm really excited to see your conversations. And just this is the summary, right? So retreat is controversial. How it occurs, particularly when we start thinking about equity or which government levels should be taking responsibility for relocation, is particularly controversial. Answering those questions is going to be a massive challenge. And some of those answers are not going to be scientific. Some of those answers are going to be value judgments, and those need to come from the communities who are affected. And then engaging in those debates, I think actually creates a real opportunity to shift our mindset towards the transformation that we need to be thinking about in order to address climate change. So I'm going to stop there and really looking forward to your questions and discussion.
Thank you so much for that presentation. That was, anyway, I have many questions of my own. So we actually have a bunch of questions rolling in. So I think I'm just going to start from the top and we'll kind of see how it goes. And then if we have some time, I have a few stock questions that we might get to. So our first question that came in fire-prone areas of California, we have discussed retreat, although fire-prone now feels like the majority of the state. What can we learn from flood experiences, and what flood-prone areas could learn from us, meaning from the wildfire perspective?
Absolutely. So there's a major discussion about relocation in response to wildfires. One of the distinctions is the return cycle. So floods, I'm speaking to a bunch of hydrologists, you know this better than I do, right? But floods tend to recur in the same areas over and over again. And a flood occurring in 1 year does not mean that it won't occur the next year. Unlike fire, where sometimes at least if a fire comes through, it has burned up all its fuel, it might be less likely to reoccur. Or at least there's a perception that it's less likely to occur. So it's a little unclear about how relocation works in a context where there's even greater uncertainty about where and when that hazard will occur. And I think that's going to be a really interesting conversation to see how it occurs. But major takeaways that at least I take away from the fire context is we already see people who are relocating away from fire-prone areas. There was a great story about people who left Paradise, California. They didn't want to rebuild. They moved to Tennessee or Kentucky. Okay, I think Tennessee. Anyway, and then other neighbors from Paradise followed them. And so now there's like a community of people who lived in Paradise, California, who now live in Tennessee or Kentucky. And I wish I can remember which one, because they relocated. And they did that with not managed retreat. They just did that on their own, right? And so one of the lessons I take away from the flood context is how much better would it be if there were a support system in place to help people like that who want to relocate somewhere else to do so, and to do so in groups, or to help them maintain those community ties in their new place. So the need for support systems for people who want to relocate is a major takeaway in any hazard area. And then the other one is, that's a big one, is how do you prevent redevelopment of that land before the government can come in? So government relocation is often really slow, right? It moves at the speed of bureaucracy. In fact, floodplain buyouts have been shown to take about 5 years on average. Some places can reduce that down to 6 months, but with federal funding, it's often a 2 to 3 year process at least. So in the meantime, developers can come into the floodplain areas or to wildfire prone areas, as we saw in Paradise or in other communities, and they will buy up that land from residents who maybe want to get out, and they'll redevelop it, and then they're selling it on to a new family. And so the question is that new family any safer than the old one, right? What has been put in place to make sure they are safer? And is that, if we don't want to see that kind of redevelopment happen, what kind of regulations do we need to put in place to make sure it doesn't, or to prevent developers in the market from keeping this land on, in the market and putting families at risk? So sorry, that was a really long answer to that question, but yeah. But it's a really interesting topic to think about the parallels.
No, it is. And it's such a complicated issue as well. So anyway, I'm glad we're having these conversations. So the next question that came in low capacity communities, that typically have lower capabilities and capacities, what support mechanisms or support models are in place that can help these communities understand risk and develop solutions? Keep in mind that low capacity communities may not take the initiative to apply for grants and the like. Yeah, this is a major concern. So for example, sorry, I mentioned when we were doing interviews with buyout practitioners, and every buyout practitioner we spoke to, or almost every buyout practitioner we spoke to, knows of a community or has a community in their state who wants to use buyouts but can't, because they lack the capacity, they lack the staff or the finances or whatever it is. And I'm using buyouts as an example, but I imagine that these same constraints are present in other types of federal flood mitigation grants. And solving that is a real challenge. The best approach I've seen so far is the use of consultants and the use of state resources. So states that invest heavily in their state level capacity are then able to serve as assistants for low capacity local governments. So they can provide training, they can provide one-on-one hands assistance with applying grants, they can raise awareness about grants, they can provide technical assistance, mapping assistance, right? All kinds of different services if the state has capacity. But the states also have a wide range of capacity. Some places have staffs of dozens, some places have staffs of one, right? And so they're going to vary wildly in their ability to help their local governments. So I think there's something to be said there. There's also, at least one of the suggestions that's been raised by local administrators was for FEMA to actually invest more in local capacity building, or even invest in state level capacity building to help local governments. So rather than providing, say, management fees on a grant, could FEMA provide consistent annual funding to a state level position to help local governments raise awareness? So maybe there's something the federal government can do there as well to help with those. Consultants play a big role in this as well. That's still an equity concern because who can hire them, but their expertise is really key in helping local governments who lack that expertise and that staff, but maybe they do have the money, but they don't have the expertise. Then consulting companies can do appear to play a big role there. That's also a huge equity question that we're gonna have to dig into. Another one is, what happens when FEMA no longer offers buyouts to single family homes, or is this something that you're seeing happening?
So right now that isn't, so right now we imagine that program is going to continue. So there is a question of at what point will the federal government lose appetite for disaster responses or for rebuilding repetitive floods, et cetera. But we haven't seen movement on that so far. I see a note from DeCarlo Brown saying that it's happening now in Maryland. I'd love to learn more about that. I haven't seen a place where FEMA has refused to do buyouts. There are places where FEMA will refuse to do it because it's not cost effective. So FEMA has a congressional mandate to use its money in a cost-effective manner. This means that there are many homes that FEMA will not fund the acquisition of because their price is too high relative to the benefits that they would experience, or because these are areas that haven't experienced a presidentially declared disaster. So there are many places that experience flood, particularly nuisance flooding or low-level flooding, that don't rise to the level of presidentially declared disasters. And then that can be a major obstacle as well, because then you're not eligible for many of the pots of money that would fund those types of relocations.
The next question is, what are your thoughts on how local government can deny buyouts for homeowners that want it in order to preserve housing stock and a tax base? I've seen this in a small community that doesn't have a lot of capacity/resources. Do you have any solutions in mind?
No, this is I wish I did. This is a major concern. So for example, well, okay, maybe I won't call it any particulars, but yeah, there are a lot of places where they're trying to do buyouts, but local governments are really the gatekeepers in many ways. So local governments are the authorities. Some states will offer buyouts in communities to residents directly, but this is rare. Most states want to respect local autonomy and local governance, and so they don't want to go against the local government's wishes. Like New York State offering buyouts in Staten Island and Oakwood Beach against the desires of New York City was in some ways an exception, right? And that seems to be sort of a negotiation that the state and the city arrived at. In fact, one of the criteria for purchasing homes after Sandy was that the state and the city would reach a mutual understanding of the benefits of the buyout before they would be offered. So that sounds like there's going to be a real negotiation process there. So the state government can play a major role in trying to convince the local governments, but this is a problem. Yeah, if local governments aren't willing to engage, if they are too concerned about the loss of tax revenue, the homeowner is the one who's going to suffer. And I don't have a solution for that yet, and I wish I did.
Our next question is, how do we get used to the different rate of change associated with climate change adaptation? And I guess also in the context of your work.
Yeah, so this is an area as a lawyer I'm really interested in, because our legal systems and our political systems are often designed to be slow, right? Like we complain about the lack of congressional action, et cetera, but like the two-house system was designed to slow down legislative action because our founding fathers were concerned about rapid governmental response to things. And our law is slow to change because we want to give people predictability. We want them to be able to rely on past decisions in the future. And so to upend those premises, right? You've probably all seen pieces on non-stationarity, how we're moving from an assumption that the future will sort of look like the past to this idea that now we know that's not true. But a lot of our social systems, our decision-making mechanisms, our laws are still tied up in this idea that we have to rely on the past. One of my favorite examples about this is that Major League Baseball, according to the US Supreme Court, is not a business, right? It is not in the money-making business. Because they made this decision back in, I don't remember, 1912 or something, right? Early on in the 19th century. And as a result, they will not change it. So NFL, NHL, all those places are businesses, but Major League Baseball not, because they once made that decision and they don't want to revoke it because we rely so heavily on these past decisions. So there's a huge challenge in terms of how do we change our social systems to address this. Sorry, this is again like a really rambling answer in response to your question, but I think it's more difficult than just trying to show people sea level rise curves or show them the hockey stick graphs or anything else like that. There are some of these fundamental principles about the fact that we hold property right forever. And what does it mean to hold a property right forever? Or what does it mean to have a government obligation to maintain flood prone roads forever? Like really forever? Like for the next 2,000 years, we are going to keep rebuilding roads that might be 30 feet underwater. Is that really what we mean? Or is there some process to get away from that? And so I think there's some of these more fundamental key points that we're going to have to rethink. How do we think about change? How do we think about embracing changing circumstances in our decision making? And I am concerned that the rate at which we are going to make those changes is too slow to stay up with the rate of climate change, right? So again, these are a lot of great questions I wish I had better answers to than I do.
No, I think you're providing a really just interesting, different perspective. So I've been really enjoying your answers. So actually, just kind of a related question of my own. Often when we talk about retreat in these capacities, it's in the context of personal homes or property. But I mean, in the context of my own work, as maybe some have seen in my talk, was looking at other infrastructure systems or other assets in those realms. I guess I'm curious, do you come across that often in terms of roads or electric plants or water treatment facilities, or even like the physical movement of an entire town, which obviously encompasses much more than just housing?
Yeah, and what's interesting is that maybe this is just because this is where the research is at, but I have more examples off the top of my head of whole towns relocating than I do of like electrical substations or someone recently asking about schools. You know what? I don't have any examples of schools relocating due to flood. There probably are some, and I'm sure I'm missing them. Those do exist, right? But they're not showing up. And roads I've been thinking about as a real challenge in some ways because many states are legally obligated to maintain roads or water or other service connections to homes. And so as long as the home is there, there's a legal obligation to maintain that network that is servicing that home. And so you are limited in your ability to relocate the roads or the other infrastructure so long as that home is still there. And that's actually one of the major incentives from a governance standpoint of relocating some of these homes is not just, hey, we want these homes out, but it's, hey, we can no longer maintain the safety of the evacuation route from this neighborhood. And so we need these homes to be gone because we can no longer maintain the safety of these roads, or because we can no longer reliably provide septic or water, or septic is becoming a major issue for places with sea level rise and groundwater level rise. Right? How else do you service these homes? Businesses have, there are examples of businesses relocating and historic monuments relocating. Businesses represent a logistical challenge, especially for businesses that need to stay open during the relocation. Like they can't wait 5 years for a relocation to reopen, right? So how do you maintain a continuity of business service while relocating a building? And that needs to be much more expedited. The federal programs and most of the emphasis though has been on residents and residential areas, partly because of, I think, the national flood insurance. And so there's a financial incentive to the federal government to try to reduce its exposure there. And then partly because of these network connection issues, I think.
Yeah, that's all really fascinating. Another question is, how much does the type of flooding, coastal, fluvial, pluvial, matter in terms of the types of options available? And maybe more importantly, how much does it affect the nature of the conversation?
Yeah, this is interesting. So one of the biggest way that this affects relocation is actually in the price of the property. So the biggest place we see is that most buyouts are occurring they're not beachfront buyouts. Most, in fact, I think I'd be hard pressed. There are some, but they're rare. Yeah, and partly that's because the price of those properties is so high, and the high price means it's harder to afford, right? The local government may have to. So, for example, FEMA through its hazard mitigation grant program will pay 75% of the costs. The other 25% usually comes from the local government, the state government, maybe from HUD, some combination of the above. But even coming up with 10% of $1 million property on the beach can be cost prohibitive to a lot of places. So there's a real concern there. There's a challenge in making it seem cost effective. And then to the challenge that was raised in the question about like local governments who don't want to lose their tax property base, they specifically don't want to lose the high value, high property tax paying properties on the beach. So there's a real concern about those. So the conversation in the coastal areas changes primarily because of the economics are different. Some of the demographics are different too, but it's primarily about those economic issues. The function of how the buyouts actually occur is very much the same in both of those situations.
We just had another question come in. How can we shift insurance premiums to follow the risk rather than spread risk to lower communities? And then a follow-up is, secondly, what planning tool is being used? Note, FEMA firm maps are designed for insurance purposes, not for planning. How can we develop national flood models based upon extreme events would offer a better perspective on that actual risk?
Yeah, so a bunch of good questions in this. So there has been a recent reform, right? We're now under FEMA Risk 2.0, and I will be frank that I don't know enough of the details about FEMA Risk 2.0 to give a great critique of that right now. Some of this I think is a wait and see, like how is this going to affect people? But absolutely this reform of it's the challenge of the balance, right? How do you on the one hand price in risk so that people are paying accurate amount of money, and that they're getting that market signal. Like they maybe really understand that, yeah, you are $20,000 a year worth of risk. And at the same time, not price out low income historic communities who don't have another option of where to live. Yeah. And I think some of that's going to happen slowly. The big piece that seems to be missing about that is that reform in insurance pricing almost has to come from an equity and even a logistics standpoint with a conversation about building new housing. And that piece seems to be lacking / isn't having the planning that you're talking about. So, hey, we're going to raise insurance prices in places. Some people will be priced out of their homes. Are we then building housing anywhere else that they can afford to live? And right now, those two conversations don't seem to be paired. And partly that's because they're housed in different federal agencies, and they're often housed in different local agencies. And you know, I had a mentor once who told me that intergovernmental collaboration is even more challenging than international collaboration. Like they're still speaking different languages, they're still using different acronyms, they still have different incentives. So we need a lot more of that intergovernmental conversation to have that holistic planning. And then your point on the FEMA maps is exactly right. So most places many places are using FEMA maps for their planning, which is a problem. And so some places are and have the capacity. This also comes back to a capacity issue. Places that have the capacity to do better flood mapping, to do futuristic, you know, or future looking flood mapping, have an advantage there for their planning. But one of the big issues that seems to be happening is that flood risk isn't being taken into account in these developments almost at all. So one of the first steps is just before we even get to the conversation over which map do they use, just getting them to the point of the conversation where they acknowledge that flood risk is a thing that should be influencing where development happens or whether development happens. And I'm thinking about Delaware. In Delaware, at least in some of the counties in Delaware, we're building 2.5 times faster in the 10-year floodplain than we are outside of it. So not just the 100-year, but the 10-year floodplain. Yes, we're putting in new subdivisions, we're putting in new roads. Our evacuation roads already flood when it rains. So like these are major challenges. Yeah. And so the starting conversation before we even get to which maps are best is just, hey, take this into account. And that's a really hard conversation to have.
Oh, that definitely is. We had another question. Any thoughts on providing towns with conservation benefits or to pay towns that conserve coastal or flooded areas?
Yeah, so this actually ties into the community rating system with the National Flood Insurance Program, right? So they do provide incentives for open space, either open space that is preserved or open space that is created through buyouts. Buyouts are actually one of the best ways to get more credits under the community rating system because you get credits both for the buyout and for creating the open space. So it can really affect your community rating score. However, there are so many communities that don't participate in the community rating system or that don't take that into account. And there is something interesting about like the benefit from the community rating system doesn't go to the community, it goes to the homeowners through a reduced insurance price, right? So there has been some discussion, although I haven't seen it progress very far in terms of how could you reform the community rating system to actually provide incentive to the community rather than relying on the homeowners to put pressure on their community, because that's a bit of a messy mechanism, right? So I think it's a great idea and I'd love to see it pursued, but I haven't seen any wonderful solutions in terms of adopting that.
All right, I think we have one last question here. This year, we have seen localized events of extreme rainfall that cause severe but local flooding. The net loss falls below the FEMA threshold for disaster declaration. Is this consideration part of the narrative?
Yeah, so this is a major concern, especially in buyouts. If a town experiences flooding, but it does not get a presidential disaster declaration, that limits the sources of the resources, the financial resources it has access to. So we're seeing increasing number of towns, cities particularly, and states that are creating local or state sources of funding for relocation because they don't want to have to rely on presidential disaster declarations, or they want more flexibility and they want to be able to do faster buyouts. For the towns that can do that, it's absolutely an optimal solution. For the towns that can't, we come back to that equity and capacity issue and trying to think about how we can improve their ability to take on some of those additional steps as well.
Awesome. And then my wrap-up question for everyone is, well, also thank you again for your presentation. This has been really fascinating. Do you have any opportunities to collaborate or other opportunities in general you'd like to share with the audience today? Or is there anything you're seeking at the moment, collaborators, students, funding, partners, et cetera?
Yeah, well, I'm always funding, our academics, right? I don't have any particular ones at the moment. We're starting a new project. We're going to be looking at floodplain development. So what local communities are doing to not build new houses in the floodplains. If anyone knows of great examples, if you have great examples of towns that have avoided development in the floodplain, that would be great to know. And then I'll just make a pitch that I'm at the Disaster Research Center. So there's about 12 faculty there who are all focused on the social science of disasters. So to the extent that you are thinking about the social science implications, we have an amazing library of resources, the Quarantelli library. We have an amazing database of like all the reports and studies that people put out, and then just a great set of experts beyond myself who have a lot more expertise in terms of disaster recovery.
Awesome. That's great. So we're actually right at time at 1 o'clock, but I just want to thank you wholeheartedly again for joining us today. This has been a really great presentation, and I also very much enjoyed the discussion that happened after this as well.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you for all the questions.